Welcome to VSOW. Today we're diving into a problem that feels so huge these days. Like just this massive flood of information and how it's messing with our minds.
Yeah, and not just messing with our minds, but like it's changing how we see the world. Like our trust and stuff in the news, institutions, even each other.
It's almost like the more we know, the less sure we are about anything.
Exactly. And that's what makes this so important to unpack. We're wading through a ton of research and notes today to try and get a handle on this, right?
Yeah.
To help people understand what's going on.
And more importantly, what can we do about it? How can we, as individuals, learn to swim in this ocean of information without getting swept away by the current?
Right. Because it really can feel like drowning sometimes, can't it?
Absolutely. So let's start with the impact. I mean, we're all feeling it to some degree, but what are the specific, tangible ways this information overload is hitting our mental health? The notes we have here highlight some pretty serious negative impacts.
Yeah, there's some big ones that keep popping up, like
Oh,
anxiety, right? It's just this constant feeling of being on edge, like you need to keep up with everything.
always plugged in, always scrolling, always refreshing.
Exactly. And that
Yeah.
just feeds this stress loop. Plus, you've got this decision paralysis thing happening.
Yeah.
Like, with so many options and opinions bombarding us, it gets harder to make even the simplest choices.
Like even ordering takeout can be a struggle.
Seriously. And that ties back to our executive function, the part of our brain that handles focus and self-control. Information overload just wears it down.
No wonder we feel so exhausted all the time.
Exactly. It's this constant mental drain. You just feel emotionally wiped out like you've run a marathon just by checking your phone. And then there's the thing they're calling news fatigue.
Oh, yeah, I've definitely felt that.
It's basically this chronic stress from being exposed to so much, especially negative news, all the time. In one study, like almost 23% of people said that the news was a major source of stress in their lives.
Wow. And that actually makes a lot of sense. It feels like we're constantly bombarded with bad news. It's overwhelming.
It really is. And here's the kicker. When we're already feeling mentally fried, it becomes way easier to fall for misinformation.
Because we don't have the energy left to really think critically about what we're reading and seeing.
Exactly.
Right.
And to make matters worse, there's this whole FOMO thing, the fear of missing out.
Which social media just loves to feed, right? Like it's this never-ending highlight reel.
It's a recipe for disaster. You're
Mm.
constantly comparing yourself, feeling anxious that you're not doing enough, seeing enough, experiencing enough. It's just this vicious cycle of overload and anxiety.
Okay, so we've painted a pretty bleak picture of the impact on our mental well-being. But let's talk about the mechanisms behind all this.
Hmm.
Our notes highlight social media algorithms as major contributors to both the overload and the spread of misinformation.
Oh, yeah. Social media algorithms, they're like the puppet masters of the information age. And they're not necessarily malicious, right?
Hmm.
But the way they're designed, well, it creates this perfect storm for misinformation to thrive.
How do they work? How do these algorithms actually function to create this environment?
Well, think about it. The goal of any social media platform is to keep you engaged, right? To keep you scrolling, clicking, and liking. So the algorithms are designed to prioritize content that triggers you emotionally.
So the more dramatic or shocking something is, the more likely it is to show up in our feeds.
Exactly. And that's where the problem lies. Because misinformation, especially the juicy, sensational stuff, often elicits strong emotional responses. So it gets amplified, shared, and spreads like wildfire, regardless of whether it's actually true.
So the algorithms aren't necessarily pushing misinformation on purpose, but they're inadvertently favoring it because it's more engaging.
Right. And then there's the whole filter bubble effect, where you're only seeing content that aligns with your existing views and beliefs. The algorithms are basically like, hey, you like this conspiracy theory? Well, here are 5 more just like it.
So it's reinforcing our biases and limiting our exposure to different perspectives.
Exactly. And that makes it really hard to break free from those echo chambers. It's like living in a world where everyone is constantly validating your every thought, even the ones that are totally off base. Plus, these algorithms are really good at tapping into our cognitive biases.
What now?
Cognitive biases, they're like these mental shortcuts our brains use to process information quickly. And unfortunately, they can make us more susceptible to misinformation.
Give me an example.
Sure. One common bias is confirmation bias. We tend to favor information that confirms what we already believe, even if it's not true.
Oh yeah, I've definitely been guilty of that. It's easier to believe something that fits with our worldview, right?
Right. And misinformation peddlers know this. They exploit these biases to make their content more appealing and shareable.
So, not only are the algorithms prioritizing sensational content, they're also feeding our biases and keeping us in these echo chambers. And to top it all off, we don't even really know how these algorithms work because they're basically trade secrets.
That's right. There's this huge lack of transparency. It's like a black box. We feed in data and out pops who knows what.
And that makes it incredibly difficult to hold these platforms accountable.
Exactly. And we can't forget about visual misinformation. Stuff like doctored images, memes, and even deepfakes.
Eat fakes. Those are the videos where they make it look like someone is saying or doing something they never did, right?
Yep. And they're getting so realistic that it's becoming harder to distinguish between real and fake. Platforms like Facebook and Instagram, where visual content reigns supreme, are particularly vulnerable to this.
So even if platforms are trying to combat misinformation, like with fact-checking and flagging systems, they're still playing catch-up.
Always. The volume of content is just so overwhelming, and the misinformation keeps evolving. It's a constant battle.
And all of this whole ecosystem of information overload and misinformation ultimately erodes trust in, well, pretty much everything.
Right. The media, our institutions, even in ourselves. Our notes here highlight several areas where this erosion is particularly concerning.
Let's start with the media. How has misinformation impacted our trust in news sources?
Well, it's pretty bad, honestly. Studies show that exposure to misinformation, whether we believe it or not, just makes us more skeptical of all news, even from legitimate sources. And then you've got the rise of fake news websites that deliberately mimic real news outlets.
So it becomes harder to tell what's real and what's not.
Exactly. And that's dangerous,
Right.
especially during crises or important events when we need accurate information the most. It makes it really hard for reliable news sources to cut through the noise.
And what about political institutions? How has this dynamic affected our trust in government and democracy?
It's complicated. It seems like exposure to certain types of misinformation can actually increase trust among specific groups. But for others, it leads to a decrease in trust, especially if the misinformation aligns with their existing political views.
So it's kind of like a double-edged sword.
Yeah. And either way, it contributes to this growing polarization and distrust in democratic processes. Plus, you've got deliberate misinformation campaigns designed to sow discord and manipulate public opinion, especially around elections and policy issues.
So it's not just about individual beliefs. It's about deliberately undermining faith in the entire system.
Right. And the scary thing is, these efforts can have long-term consequences for democratic stability. It erodes people's faith in the institutions that are supposed to represent them, which makes it harder to address real problems and find common ground.
It's like a vicious cycle. The more distrust there is, the harder it becomes to solve problems, which just leads to more distrust.
Exactly. And this erosion of trust isn't limited to just our own countries. It's happening globally. It affects our faith in international organizations, governments worldwide, justice systems. It undermines international cooperation.
So basically, misinformation is chipping away at the foundations of global trust.
Yeah. And technology, especially the rapid development of AI, is just making things worse. With things like generative AI, misinformation can now spread even faster and wider than ever before. It's a serious concern.
Okay, so we've established that misinformation is bad for society. But let's zoom back in on the individual. We've touched on the mental costs, but our notes go into more detail about the specific psychological and cognitive consequences of information overload.
Right. It's not just about feeling stressed or anxious. It's actually changing how our brains function.
Okay, break it down for me. What are the specific psychological impacts?
Well, as we talked about earlier, there's the anxiety and stress. It's like being in a constant state of fight or flight. Then there's the decision fatigue and emotional exhaustion. You just feel overwhelmed and depleted. And then there's the irritability and news fatigue. Like, I'm sure we all know that feeling of wanting to just chuck our phones out the window sometimes.
Oh, absolutely. And it's not just that we're consuming too much information, but that a lot of it is negative or emotionally charged.
Exactly. It takes a toll. And then, of course, there's the FOMO, which just keeps us glued to our screens and perpetuates the cycle. It's like a digital addiction.
So we're anxious, stressed, exhausted, and addicted to our phones. What about the cognitive impacts? What's happening in our brains?
Okay, so think about it. Our brains have limited processing power, right? Like a computer with a finite amount of RAM. And when we're constantly bombarded with information, our working memory gets overloaded. It's like trying to run a bunch of heavy programs at the same time. Things start to slow down, and eventually the whole system crashes.
So we're basically pushing our brains to their breaking point.
Pretty much. And that leads to all sorts of problems. We get worse at making decisions, focusing, and remembering things. Multitasking becomes impossible because our attention is constantly divided.
And because we're trying to process so much information, we end up skimming and taking shortcuts instead of really engaging with the material.
Right. We rely more on heuristics, which are like mental rules of thumb that help us make quick decisions. But they can also lead us astray because they're based on simplified assumptions.
So basically, information overload makes us dumber.
Well, I wouldn't say dumber, but it definitely makes it harder to think clearly and critically. Our brains just aren't designed to handle this much input.
Okay, so the picture isn't pretty, but we can't just give up, right? We have to find ways to manage this overload and protect ourselves from misinformation. What are some strategies we can use? Our notes talk about shifting from measuring our information intake to finding practical ways to cope.
Right. Measuring how much information we consume is kind of like measuring how much air we breathe. It's happening constantly, and obsessing over the numbers isn't going to help. Instead, we need to focus on changing our behaviors and developing coping mechanisms.
Like what? Give us some specific examples.
Okay, so first, let's talk about behavioral changes. One thing we can do is be more intentional about how we use our time. Set clear priorities and use tools like SMART goals and time blocking to help us focus on what's important.
So instead of just mindlessly scrolling through social media, we need to be deliberate about what we're consuming and why.
Exactly. And another important thing is to schedule regular information detox periods, like actually disconnect from technology and news for a while.
Digital detox. I've heard of that.
Yeah, it's like a mental cleanse. It gives your brain a chance to rest and recharge.
Yeah.
And while you're at it, mute those non-essential notifications. Seriously, they're just distractions.
Okay, those are some good behavioral tips.
Yeah.
What about structural changes? What can we do to change our environment to make it less overwhelming?
So one thing that can help is to leverage automation tools. Things like email filters and RSS feeds can help you streamline the flow of information so you're not constantly bombarded with stuff you don't need.
And what about that second brain concept I've heard people talking about?
Yes, the second brain. It's basically a system for organizing and storing information outside of your head so you don't have to remember everything. It could be as simple as a notebook or as complex as a digital note-taking app. The point is to have a system that helps you manage the flow of information.
So instead of trying to keep everything in our heads, we need to find ways to offload some of that cognitive burden.
Exactly. And then there are the cognitive strategies. These are about strengthening our mental muscles so we're better equipped to handle the information onslaught.
Like learning to be more critical of what we read and see.
Exactly. We need to hone our fact-checking skills and learn how to identify misinformation. There are tons of resources available online that teach you how to do this.
And what about mindfulness? How does that fit in?
Mindfulness can actually be really helpful for managing the anxiety associated with FOMO. It helps us to be more present and appreciate what we have instead of constantly comparing ourselves to others.
So it's about cultivating a more intentional relationship with information.
Precisely. And all of these strategies work together. It's not about doing just one thing, but about developing a holistic approach to information management.
So it's about setting priorities, curating our sources, being more active in our engagement, setting boundaries, managing our time, embracing minimalism, taking breaks, and even sharing the load by discussing information with others.
You got it. It sounds like a lot, but even implementing a few of these strategies can make a big difference.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground. We've talked about the psychological and cognitive impacts of information overload, the role of social media algorithms, the erosion of trust, and some strategies for coping. But our notes specifically highlight social media as a major culprit here. Can you elaborate on how these platforms are contributing to the problem?
Sure. Social media is designed to be addictive, right? It's like a slot machine in your pocket. Every time you open the app, there's a chance you'll see something new, exciting, or enraging. And that keeps you coming back for more.
So it's playing on our basic human desire for novelty and stimulation.
Exactly. And the constant stream of content makes it impossible to keep up. There's always something new to see, something new to read, something new to react to. It's exhausting.
And then there are the algorithms, which we've already talked about.
Right. They're constantly showing us stuff that's designed to keep us engaged, which often means emotionally charged content, whether it's true or not. And then there's the whole echo chamber effect, which reinforces our biases and isolates us from different perspectives.
And it's not just the content itself, it's the way social media is structured, with multiple communication channels and notifications constantly vying for our attention.
It's like a never-ending barrage of pings, dings, and alerts. It's impossible to focus when you're constantly being interrupted. And all of this leads to this feeling of being overwhelmed and exhausted, like you're never caught up, you're never doing enough.
It's like this pressure cooker of information.
And that pressure makes it harder to think critically, to discern truth from falsehood, to make good decisions.
And it's not just about the volume of information, it's also about the quality.
Right. A lot of what we see on social media is superficial, trivial, or downright harmful. It's like junk food for the brain.
And it's addictive.
Exactly. We keep going back for more, even though we know it's not good for us.
So we've got this perfect storm brewing. We're overwhelmed with information, much of it is low quality, and we're constantly being bombarded with notifications and updates. No wonder we're all so stressed out.
Right. And this is where the connection between information overload and misinformation becomes really clear.
Because when we're already overwhelmed, it's harder to resist the lure of misinformation.
Exactly. Misinformation often preys on our emotions, our biases, and our desire for simple explanations. And when we're already mentally fatigued, it's easier to fall for those traps. Plus, misinformation adds to the overall volume of content we're trying to process, making it even harder to find the truth.
So it's this vicious cycle. Information overload makes us more susceptible to misinformation, and misinformation just adds to the overload.
Exactly. And that's why it's so important to develop strategies for managing both. We need to be more mindful of our information consumption habits, more critical of what we read and see, and more proactive in seeking out diverse perspectives.
Okay, so we've talked about how information overload and misinformation are intertwined, but where is all this misinformation coming from? Our notes list some of the common
Well,
sources.
there's no shortage of sources, unfortunately. Social media, of course, is a huge one, with its rapid-fire sharing, limited oversight, and algorithms that prioritize engagement over accuracy. It's like a breeding ground for misinformation.
And then you've got those super spreaders we were talking about earlier.
Right. These are the individuals or groups who are responsible for creating and disseminating a disproportionate amount of misinformation. They're often very skilled at manipulating social media algorithms and exploiting people's biases.
And then there are the fake news websites that deliberately try to mimic legitimate news sources.
Right. They often use sensational headlines and deceptive designs to trick people into believing their content. And then there's all the multimedia content out there, like doctored images, manipulated videos, and deepfakes.
And health misinformation, that's a big one, especially these days.
Oh, yeah. False claims about vaccines, cures, and public health measures can spread like wildfire online, often with serious consequences. And then, of course, you've got the echo chambers and ideological bubbles that form online, where misinformation gets amplified and reinforced within like-minded communities.
And those echo chambers are often fueled by conspiracy theories, which prey on people's fears and anxieties.
Right. Conspiracy theories offer simple explanations for complex events, and they often tap into people's distrust of authority. And once someone falls down the rabbit hole, it can be very hard to get them back out.
So it's like a multi-headed hydra. You cut off one source of misinformation and another one pops up in its place.
It can feel that way. But the key is to understand the mechanisms by which misinformation spreads and to develop strategies for combating it. We need to be more critical of our sources, more aware of our own biases, and more willing to engage in respectful dialogue with people who hold different views.
It feels like we've come full circle. Back to those algorithms we were talking about earlier, our notes stress the importance of understanding their role in all of this.
They're the gatekeepers of information in the digital age. They determine what we see, what we read, and what we believe. And the problem is, they're not neutral.
So how exactly are algorithms contributing to the spread of misinformation?
Well, as we talked about earlier, they're designed to prioritize engagement, which often means prioritizing sensational or emotionally charged content. And since misinformation often fits that description, it tends to get amplified.
And the algorithms also play a role in creating those filter bubbles and echo chambers, right?
Exactly. By showing us content that aligns with our existing beliefs and preferences, they limit our exposure to diverse perspectives and critical information. And they also exploit our cognitive biases, making us more likely to believe information that confirms what we already think.
And to make matters worse, we don't even fully understand how these algorithms work because they're considered trade secrets.
Right. That lack of transparency makes it incredibly difficult to hold platforms accountable and to develop effective solutions. And then there's the whole issue of generative AI, which is making it easier than ever to create convincing deepfakes and other forms of fabricated content.
So even if platforms wanted to crack down on misinformation, it's like trying to hit a moving target.
Exactly. It's a constant cat and mouse game. And unfortunately, the stakes are incredibly high.
Well, it's said has been a sobering, but I think ultimately helpful conversation. We've covered a lot of ground today, from the psychological and cognitive impacts of information overload to the insidious ways in which misinformation spreads and erodes trust in our institutions. It's clear that these are complex and interconnected challenges that we need to face head on.
Absolutely. But the good news is that there are things we can do. We can learn to manage the information onslaught, to be more critical of what we consume, and to seek out diverse perspectives.
We can also advocate for more transparency and accountability from social media platforms and work to create a more informed and discerning public.
Exactly. The fight against misinformation and information overload is one we can win, but it's going to take effort from all of us.
So, listener, as we wrap up this deep dive, we want to leave you with a few questions to ponder. What aspect of this issue resonated most with you? What insights will you take away from this conversation? How will you change your own information consumption habits going forward?
We hope that this deep dive has given you some food for thought and perhaps even some motivation to take action.
If you found this deep dive valuable, please consider subscribing to our channel for more in-depth explorations of critical issues. And don't forget to like and leave a comment to share your thoughts and help others discover this content.
Thanks for listening to VSOW. We'll see you next time.